Welcome back. What I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the idea of how we define life, what it means when we talk about something being a living thing. After all, this is a biology course, the study of life, so let's consider that. First of all, one of the things is what we want to do is we want to try to think about how we define living things. What are the characteristics of something that cause us to label it as being alive? Now, by the time we're done with this semester, or even as we go through this discussion, you're going to want to think about whether you agree or disagree with the list of characteristics that I suggest to you. You may decide you want to come up with your own list of characteristics that define something as being alive. What I'll do, however, is I'll give you a basic list of characteristics that is not necessarily the only one we could come up with, but think of it as the one that's most commonly accepted by the greatest number of biologists. There is some disagreement, however. So let's consider what some of these characteristics are. If we found something new, and we had to decide, is this a life form? What checklist would we use? What would we look for to try to distinguish it as being a life form? Well, here's a few of the characteristics. One of the things we say is that all living things are composed of cells. Matter of fact, later when we talk a little bit about viruses, or when you take a microbiology class that deals with viruses in more detail, you may want to ask yourself a question whether they're alive or not. Well, from this very first characteristic, you'd have to conclude that they're not a life form. So today, we would argue that all living things have at their very basic level a cellular composition. One of the things we find with living things also is that they have the quality of growth. Now, this can mean different things for different kinds of organisms. If I was talking about growth in terms of you as an individual, you might think of that as you starting out as a single cell and multiplying and growing and becoming larger and developing into a multicellular structure. But for something like a bacterial population, we think of growth as being the multiplication of the individuals in the population, but we can think of those as both being qualities of cell division giving rise to a process of growth. We feel that all living things have some quality of metabolism. And what is that? Well, in a simple sense, we're saying that organisms take in materials from their environment and process them. In particular, we're interested in how organisms process and change and make use of energy. And so we're going to have a couple chapters where we deal with those ideas. How do living things process energy, modify it, change it? How does it get passed on to other organisms within the environment? Another characteristic that we typically associate with living things is the quality of homeostasis. Now, please don't think of homeostasis as being static. In other words, I don't want you to think of homeostasis as an organism keeping their conditions exactly the same at all times. This is a dynamic process. We're talking about organisms maintaining relatively constant conditions in their cells. And so some of the mechanisms that your body uses, some of the things we'll talk about later, where our cells maintain certain conditions, chemical conditions, physical conditions, how your body maintains certain features of low temperature and pH. Well, that's the type of thing we're talking about when we think of homeostasis. Response. Now here we're talking about an organism receiving some kind of stimuli from its environment and then going through some kind of change as a result of that stimulus interacting with the cell. So we're talking about an organism having the capacity to change in response to conditions of its environment. So this idea of response. A key idea that I think just about everybody, regardless of their list of characteristics of living things, would say is a key feature of life is this quality of reproduction. The ability of one generation of organisms to give rise to other generations of organisms. In the case of humans, of course, that would be through the process of producing children. Now you can see how this can be sometimes confused or muddied a little bit with what we talked about in terms of growth previously. And so that's why as you talk about the word growth or you talk about the word reproduction, you'll want to qualify or explain to somebody what you mean by those two terms. Growth is usually thought of in the sense that we think of it for ourselves as organisms. Starting out small, getting bigger. A tree, a plant, starting as a seed and maturing into a larger organism. Reproduction is the actual production of new individuals. But you can see how when we talk about organisms like bacteria, the quality of growth and the quality of reproduction become a little less clear, a little more difficult to distinguish between. All right, so now what's the final characteristic? Because we only have a list of 7, and that's what you commonly see in most textbooks, is a list of 7 characteristics. And this one is different from the other 6 in that here we're talking about a characteristic that we think of as a population level characteristic. The previous 6 characteristics, we could be talking about an individual cell or an individual organism. But now we're talking about a population of organisms changing over generational time. And we're talking about a specific kind of change, a change in the genetic makeup, the information molecules, the DNA molecules of the population of organisms. So here's the one characteristic of the 7 that deals with populations rather than individuals. So we're thinking of this as being a quality that we feel all life forms possess, that as populations, what we expect to find, and really what we see in every case when we find living things, is that from generation to generation, and especially over longer periods of time, we see this quality of genetic change, evolution. Well, you might want to generate your own list. There are many alternative lists. Matter of fact, I think if you check the outline that I provided for you for this chapter, you'll see that I have a very short list of just 3 characteristics. Many people use different lists of characteristics to define life. And if you think about it for a moment, one of the things that we'll have to eventually deal with is, well, what are we going to do when we start to produce computer programs or computers or robots that have some of the attributes or some of the qualities that we think of as being life qualities? Will we change our list? Will we modify how we think about what it means to be alive? Think about things like viruses. They have a number of features that are very, very life-like. As a matter of fact, if you talk to a virologist, somebody who studies viruses, you might find that they are very comfortable thinking about those as a type of life form. Presently, people leave them out of our definition of life, but maybe that'll change in the future. Think about this list. Another version, another set of characteristics. See what you think about this. Things that are complex and organized, that they use some type of material and process energy in some way, that they have the capacity to maintain some type of environmental condition or a relatively constant environmental condition, that they have the qualities of growth and reproduction, they have the capacity to respond to stimuli, and of course then at a population level, the ability to change over time. So you can see this is just a slightly different version of that previous list of 7 characteristics. Think about what you feel are the qualities of life. Let me give you a little bit of a thought question that I'd like you to think about and see what conclusion you would come to. Let's say you go home today and you open up your mailbox and there's a brown box wrapped in brown paper, sort of a cigar box type of thing. You take it inside, you take off the paper, you open it up, and as you do so, a cloud of gas comes out. Now this cloud of gas hypnotizes you. And at the same time, a tape recorder that was in the box clicks on. And the information on the tape recorder that is given to you in your hypnotized state are the instructions for how to make more of these boxes. In other words, all the detailed information, how to make the gas, where to get the tape recorders, what kind of batteries to use, all of these things to build more of these kinds of structures. The last piece of information on that tape recorder is, send this to all your friends and relatives. Well, my question to you is, and this was a question I got when I was in graduate school on one of my exams, is this a life form? Is this alive? Is the box a life form? So I'd like you to consider that. Think about whether you would classify this as a life form or not, and also think about why you would either agree or disagree that it is a type of life form. Well, think about the things we've talked about. I've just tried to basically outline for you and explain a little bit some of the characteristics that are commonly used, the most common list of characteristics used by biologists to define something as being alive. Now, one of the key ideas that was part of that discussion that I didn't go into in any detail right now was the idea of information and information molecules and the flow of information that occurs in living things. You're going to find another video on informational flow, and I'd like you to make sure you take a good look at that. In addition to that, I did briefly mention the idea of change over time, this idea of evolution of organisms from generation to generation. And you're going to find another video that deals with evolution in more detail. Please make sure you take a look at that. Then consider again that idea of the cigar box, and is it a life form or not? Well, I hope you enjoyed this discussion, and I hope it gave you something to think about. Look forward to talking to you next time.